Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IWSC webinar on gin. It is great to have you all here with us today. And we have actually over 100 people joining us today from all over the world, from Argentina to Australia. So thank you all so much for finding the time, despite the busy schedules that you all have, despite the different time zones. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Mila Gorchakova. I'm part of the IWSC marketing team. And it is great to have Olivier Ward here with us today as our main speaker. Olivier is the IWSC Spirits Judging Committee member, our head judge for gin, journalist, presenter, drinks consultant. He was the co-founder of Gin Foundry and Spirits Beacon. And in a nutshell, Olivier is just the real ambassador for the gin category. So we're really thrilled to have him here today speaking about the recent changes the IWSC introduced to the gin category, as well as the gin trends worldwide. Now, just a small technical detail. Thank you all so much for submitting your questions in advance. We will do our best to answer them within the next 45 minutes or so. But if you do have any additional questions in the process, please do submit them via the Q&A button that you all should have at the bottom of your screens. Now, I'm just delighted to pass the microphone to Olivier.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you're well, or good evening if you're joining from Japan and Australia, or wherever that might be in the world. As Mila just said, the point of this session really is to try and help provide some clarity over what we do and gin as a whole from the IWSC's perspective. What I'm going to try and do for you is, explain some of the judging process, some of the changes we've made, but also talk about some of the trends that we're seeing. Gin at the IWSC is really global by nature. It is thousands of entries every single year. It is a huge part of the judging assessment that we do each and every single time. So it's a big category for IWSC, and it's also a big category in general. We're really privileged to have that international element that's been brought, and to be able to see the trends that are unfolding and playing out. Perhaps it's easiest to just explain a little bit about some of the judging panel before I get into some of the categories and the judging process, and then some of the ways that we go about evaluating a spirit. We really have some of the best judging elite distillers who have forged entire careers at the the forefront of gin. We have some of the great communicators who can put emotions and thoughts and criticisms into really concise words, far better than I can, clearly, as I mouthed my way through this morning. Bartenders, buyers. It's a really mixed set, and it's not just from the UK. They are from all over the world. They fly in for it from the US, from Australia, from Europe. So it is an international judging committee in its own right. And that's because we're looking to bring that diverse experience into the equation and into our process, as well as the different perspectives. And I talk a lot about perspectives when we talk about objective versus subjective evaluation. And I think that because it's really important to understand that we can all be objective about what we're looking at and what we're tasting and what we're experiencing, but subjectivity also plays a part, into the assessment, and that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing to have some subjectivity, so long as we can all agree on what the parameters of that might be. But so what are the categories from a gin perspective this year, and what are the changes that we're looking to do? Actually, most of it stays the same as it has done for the past 3 years. Right? So we have the specialist categories, the easiest to start off with. Cask aged gin, I think everyone knows what that involves. I don't think you just happen to age your product or have contact with oak without knowing about it. So that's a pretty obvious one. Same thing with Old Tom as a category. Same thing with slow gin as a category. Grape infused, we're trying to consolidate that a little bit into something that's like a little bit better explained, as opposed to some being in a specialist category and some being in contemporary. So we've got this grape infused category this year, so that predominantly for distillers in Australasia, they can enter this. It's a really incredibly exciting subgenre of gin, and growing at pace within Australia at the moment. So those are specialist categories. We've had those for 2-3 years now. There's no real changes there. And then, as previous years, we have flavored and contemporary. So flavored gin, as we know, has been a huge part of the growth of gin across the past 10 years. Currently represents somewhere between, I was reading some data from IWSR the other day to say that it was between 8 to 10% of the category is now flavored gin. So globally speaking. Then we've got contemporary, previous years. The change really is between London Dry, as we previously had last year and the years prior, into classic gin. So this year we have flavored gin, contemporary gin, classic gin. Now, that's obviously stirred a lot of debate and a lot of conversations, but there's a reason for it, and I'm going to go into sort of why that we think that provides much better clarity. But just on this idea of contemporary versus flavored, right? What are we defining and how are we defining? Because we get asked quite a lot, where should I enter? I think, my personal advice to you, if you're thinking I'm not sure which it is, contemporary gin pretty much instantly reads as a gin. It's just progressive. Perhaps it's, using a lot of fresh botanicals. Perhaps it's a different base, slightly different base spirit if you're in that part of the world, or a lesser distilled base spirit, not necessarily to 96% ABV. Perhaps when you pick it up and you taste it, it's definitely gin. Juniper is a big part of it. But I think with flavored gin takes that a little bit one step further, where maybe you pick it up and actually your first impression isn't juniper. Maybe it's whatever the name botanical is on the bottle. But juniper's still playing a part. Of course, it's anchoring it. Maybe it's the heart of it. Maybe it's adding depth. Maybe it's adding character. But really, I think that's one of the ways that you can start asking yourself, actually, does this read as gin immediately? It's just a contemporary version of it, or actually does it take both nose and palate to get to that point where this is clearly understood as gin? I think obviously brightly coloured, sweetened sometimes are part of the flavored category. I think if you've done both of those things, I would advise going into flavored as opposed to contemporary, because that's probably a little bit more expected there, and it's slightly you're going to get a little bit. It's a little bit easier. We factor that in when we're judging. I'll go on to that in a second. But yeah, so that's kind of a little bit about contemporary gin. Contemporary gin really is the bulk of the category nowadays. As we've seen over the past 10 years, it's one of the big reasons why gin has become so big. Consumers have really gravitated towards this idea of what gin can be: progressive flavor profiles that present a sense of place, a sense of the people who make them, that really bring some really interesting botanicals to the fore, that don't just talk about flavor profiles, but talk about entire concepts that are just encapsulated in the glass. And so contemporary gin's really it's quite broad as a spectrum, but I think reasonably easy to understand. So why classic versus London Dry, right? Because this is sort of the big question that I'm getting asked all the time in terms of the move. And I think the easiest way to explain this is to talk about the talking points around what was going on with London Dry in previous years. And we'll just talk about the talking points, and then I'll explain why we then made the move, right? So talking point number one. I have classic gin. You got flavored gin, contemporary gin, London Dry. I'm not a London Dry gin, but I'm a classic gin. Where do I go? You're like, well, hang on. That is quite difficult to answer that question. So we're not necessarily, I think actually there's a challenge area one, right? The second is actually understanding that London Dry gin is about process. It's not about flavor, right? So it's a process requirement that you adhere to from distillation. You can't add stuff onto it as defined by EU law. We all know this. But then you've got flavor category, literally flavored gin, flavor category, contemporary gin, process category, London Dry. That doesn't necessarily sit that easily within the sequence that we have. Challenge area number two. So the third area really is then going actually people's understanding of, is it flavor or is it process? Now, from a European perspective, we might all stand here and say, actually, we all understand what London Dry gin is. And you know, that's what we've been taught is gin, distilled gin, London dry gin. London dry gin's about process. Talk to a lot of Australian distillers, talk to a lot of US distillers, and you'll hear these words quite often. I make a London dry style gin. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean? Does that mean that you're making a classic style of gin that's traditional, that's really juniper forward? Or does it mean that you're actually making it in a way that's London dry? And then you start talking about then, and so there's actually quite a lot of confusion out there at distiller level, all the way through to consumer level, of course, but like at distiller level and those who are entering going, I am entering this in good faith, thinking that I am entering a London dry because I make a London dry style gin. And we're saying, no, we're about process here. But why would they understand that? Because flavor gin category is about flavor, contemporary gin category is about flavor, and London dry gin is what, only about process and not about flavor? So confusion. That was another challenge area, another conversations that we were having quite often. I would point out that, you know, not all gin makers use the word London dry gin on their label, right? So even though they're making it to a London dry spec, they might call it, I don't know, Tokyo dry gin, rare dry gin. Many others like that, they're actually made to that spec that don't use London dry. So they're asking, hey, if I enter in London dry gin, are you going to take the bottle, read it's not London dry, and say, actually, hang on a minute, I'm going to put that into a different category? And unbeknown to me, and the obvious answer is no, and we can have a conversation about that, but that's taking a lot of conversations going forward. Another question is then to go, well, actually, the value of the award, oh, you've been awarded gold and London dry gin, but I don't communicate it to my gin like that. When I talk about my gin, I talk about Melbourne dry gin. I talk about, you know, a coastal Italian gin, or like, you know, an Argentinian, you know, I'm from Buenos Aires dry gin, or Patagonian dry gin, or whatever it is. I don't talk about the term London dry because I think it confuses whatever their marketing reasons might be, they might not present it. And then all of a sudden, how they can use the award, should they get a medal, becomes lesser to them, even though they've entered in the right place. And that's not right, because we know that by getting a gold and actually marketing it, you do actually increase your chances that buyers look at it, and you do increase your rate of sale. We have tracked that as IWSC, and we can see the benefit of a medal and the value that that brings from a marketing perspective. So again, that's another challenge area, a whole other conversation that was going on there. So you can see that there's these pockets of conversation around that all amount to quite a lot of confusion. That's from the entry and producer side, right? From a judging perspective, and I look at it from our perspective, right? So as a judging team, you know, we're going and briefing judges and trying to make decisions as to how to evaluate quality by flavor and the flavor that's in front of us. In flavored gin, we talk about that. In contemporary gin, we talk about flavor. And all of a sudden, we've got a whole category in which we're judging and evaluating by flavor, although they're entered by process. So how do you then separate, you know, how do we get consistency over panel by panel by panel? Are we saying that London dry gin as an area, we should be putting metrics on the fact that actually it is about classicism as well? It is about tradition as well. And we as judges, when it's in front of us, are saying, you know, beyond the obvious, we can obviously mark down because it hasn't got sugar. We obviously, you know, mark down if it's got color or tint. But that doesn't happen because there's an amazing triage process, which I'll talk about a little bit later in terms of the judging process. But you know, if we're saying as judges, we're judging London dry gin, and part of that expectation from when you're at the desk in front of the flight is about classicism, we would have just then added to the European law, European rules. Nowhere in the EU rules does it say London dry gin is more, you know, juniper forward than distilled gin. It doesn't say that anywhere. It all has to be juniper forward, right? That's the deal. Gin, distilled gin, London dry, it's all juniper forward. So again, so there's a big conversation going on there about like, well, if we're saying classicism matters in the judging process, let's make that overt and tell you as producers, actually that matters. And let's be clear about this, as opposed to just sneak it in the back door or apply our own interpretation on top of EU law, which is not only EU specific, by the way, and not international. It's an international competition. We have so many international, entries. I don't want to be adding something that isn't there or adding to the confusion by saying actually it's both process and flavor. It's one or the other, right? So I think, so those are, again, conversations going on. And I want to just briefly touch about reclassification live, for example, or double checking and avoiding mistakes, right? So one of the other things that I, as SJC, am not concerned about, but I really try and pay attention. And I can see some of the judges are on this call already as attendees. And it's fantastic. And what I really want to make sure is that we spend so much time and effort trying to give valuable feedback, a great tasting note, a fair assessment, really concentrate, really discuss, really debate. I don't want anybody's name to go against the product, badging it, saying this is a great London dry gin. And then we find out who it is and we're like, hang on a minute, that's not London dry gin. Just because of the process. And then you can go, okay, all right, well, those errors might happen, but they happen, like they can happen in different ways. There's always that potential for it to sneak through. And I really don't want that to happen. So you then go, well, how do you avoid errors for someone mis-entering London dry gin? And that's going to be an enormous amount of work ahead of time, right? So you go, all right, let's try and pre-filter as much as we can. Let's really have an open dialogue with anybody who enters that and ask questions. And again, I can see people on this call who have had me question them as a journalist and who have batted me off on really basic questions when I've been asking you about, things where like, how's it made? What do you make it? How do you do it? What's your heart's cut? Do you know what I mean? And so and those are the kind of questions that we would all have to ask. And that's assuming you know it, of course, because you're the distillers. What happens if you're part of the marketing team and then it takes a few weeks to get it? And so it's not pragmatic, it's not practical, this idea that we would have to do the equivalent of a mortgage check on someone's background of their gin ahead of assessment. So, but then also if it's London dry gin and we as judges on the table go, how do we reclassify it? Because we do that sometimes, right? So if something's come in and it's, let's just say, a flavored gin and it's been entered into contemporary, and we're saying, look, and it's quite obvious, we can go, well, what's in front of me isn't really contemporary, it's more flavored. Should we push it into a different category? And if viewed under that category, would you objectively come to a different conclusion? And if the answer is yes, better or for worse, often for better, we reclassify. But if someone's entered as London dry and you reclassify them as contemporary, there's going to be some people who are really angry about that because they've entered this process. They're like, don't lump me in with distilled gin or whatever. And people get really passionate about it, rightly so, because they've adhered to that. So there's a big question point. You can see all of these question points and all of these things that are surrounding. And all of that is quite simply answered by the fact of move London dry to classic. All of those are actually much easier conversations to have. There's much more clarity over it. There's a clarity for those entering. Oh, it's flavor, in flavor gin, contemporary gin, classic gin. It's all about flavor profile, juniper predominance. Tradition, classicism is part of the judging thing. So we can be clearer with judges. This is what you're looking for. And actually you can judge by those metrics. And let's be overt about that. So it's clearer for us as judging. It's, and so I think that's the reasoning behind it. The thing that I would point out before I answer any of the questions that are coming in is that really this isn't a move away from London dry gin, right? I as an individual, pretty much that's the majority of what I drink, all right? So if it's not a move from IWSC perspective, it's not a move away from London dry gin in any way. All of these conversations have highlighted a few things that actually we could streamline and provide better clarity for entries by calling it classic. And we could improve the consistency of our judging process by calling it classic. That said, clearly what this has highlighted is some confusion around the term, and therefore there's need as well to support this with commitment to trying to further education around London Dry Gin. That's the great thing about IWSC. It's not just a spirits competition. There's Club O. There's all sorts of other ways that we are looking to now build and go, right, okay, if we've identified that there's a challenge, there's loads of challenge areas around this term, let's try and use our network to educate, to empower, to support, to champion. It just happens that from a judging perspective, it's a lot simpler, it's a lot clearer. From that. So hopefully I've talked about some of the talking points there, and I've answered some of the initial questions. Opportunities depends on sort of which way you look at it, right? So the thing about IWSC that I really like is that you are benchmarked against the best internationally, right? So this isn't just a UK specific competition or a region specific competition. There is literally thousands of entries. And so you need to be looking at actually you're being benchmarked on an international stage and compared to the best of international. So really when you get your medal, you can understand where you sit from a global perspective. I think the other side of it is the feedback. Really, what are the opportunities for small bat? Like, it's actually sometimes it's quite hard to get really valuable feedback from that kind of caliber individual. And I think there's a lot of effort that's been put into, from an IWSC perspective, written format and written answers, written feedback as to, in part of the evaluation, this scored this. This is the flavor profile. This is what we think. If it didn't score, for example, if it didn't score a medal, absolutely, here are 5 reasons why, or 2 reasons, whatever, and really go into that detail and explain why, because that's what we all want to know, why. Or often you'll find in the tasting notes or in the feedback notes that there are little like hints, for example, even when you do score, it's like actually couldn't score it higher because this was the overall perception, but overall fantastic otherwise. So there's that kind of feedback. I saw that, I know that you've released some of it in terms of already online via IWSC socials and on the website, but you've done the research now. I don't like a medal does increase rate of sale. It does open doors in some places. Also provides you with a great news story if you win big as well, right? When you think about winning gold or gold outstanding, that's less than 10% of less than 10% win either of those 2 medals, right? That's on a global stage. That's an enormous accolade. And that's a great news story from a local news perspective as well. So those are all a couple of things that I think are of value to brands any size, but in particular to small batch brands. So I wouldn't be too worried about this. And then this is one of the reasons why we wanted to go classic, contemporary, flavored, because there's such a massive amount of effort that goes into getting people in the right zone ahead of time, right? And this is where Dave and Adita and the organization team behind it, the triage that goes ahead of it, is so much work that's involved. It's not like we get a load of boxes and just flight them up and go for it. Do you know what I mean? So it really is, and I'll talk about the judging process in more detail. You really don't do that. And so what you have is, where's the concern, right? So if you're now that we can openly shift people and not shift people, but have zero concerns about look, someone entered that because of process and that because of flavor. Now the flavored gin, contemporary gin, classic gin are all based on essentially juniper predominance and other considerations, which I know are given as guidance already. As part of the entry things. I think they're actually also up on the website as well. But if you're a contemporary gin and you've got into classic, it's really not, because it'd be slightly different than the rest in that you might be using fresh botanicals. You judge what's in front of you and it might just stick out and you go, well, you go through your assessment, both objective and subjective, and then you ask yourself the question, clearly, there is maybe if this was in a different one, would you mark it differently? We ask that question all the time. It's really rare when someone's entered a flavored gin into classic and it's just insane. You don't necessarily get marked down. You just get marked, again, you just you get on the day, we make a note, and that happens quite often. We make a note going, didn't think this was appropriate for this one, so we've judged it as that instead, right? And that happens all the time. We're really quite keen on that, to judge what's in the glass in front of us, as opposed to just going, look, under strict rules, we're not going to move anyone, we're not going to talk about it, we're just going to say you wanted to be perceived as this. So I'm not too worried about that. If you're worried about the difference between contemporary and flavored, and I don't know, you're a contemporary gin and you've entered into flavored gin, I would point out that that probably makes you a fantastic flavored gin, because you're more easily legible as that. But again, vice versa, we ask that question all the time. Should this be reclassified based on the fact that we think it's more appropriate elsewhere? And if so, would it be perceived differently? I hope that answers the question. I don't think I quite, yeah. Sure, but then everything would change, right? So you either set up your structure on process, or you set up your structure on flavor, right? So fine. We could all have it on gin, distilled gin, London dry, no problem. IWSC hasn't been like that for 5-6 years now. So you get to a point where you go, we haven't done it on process in multiple categories. We haven't done it on EU regs, because there are no EU regs for Old Tom, by the way. There are no EU regs for grape infused. There are no EU regs for cask aged. So we've gone on flavor and best possible guidance for 5-6 years already. So this isn't new that we're not structured on gin, distilled gin, London dry. We're structured on flavor profile, and in some case juniper predominance, which in itself, I get, it's controversial, but let's work in the real world. So from a flavor, if we're already on that, having both flavor and this idea of the categories are on flavor, and then one on process, is what's confusing in the matter. So I think, yeah, you can absolutely structure it either way, but IWC hasn't been structured that way for a really long time. I would also point out it is an international gin competition, and I get that the EU regs are possibly the best formulated regulations we have globally, certainly better than the 4 lines that exist in Australia and New Zealand, and maybe the half a paragraph elsewhere in some other place. I get that it's definitely the leading set of guidelines we have, but we just haven't been structured that way. And also, so many other parts of the world just don't accept that they have to make gin in that way. And so that decision was made a long time ago. The move this year is just to bring everything into line. I totally understand that there is a legal definition to work to. When we're done with the judging assessment, we're basing it on flavor, right? So the entry requirements might be defined, but the judging criteria isn't defined by EU law, right? And so there's no legal definition to the flavor of London dry gin above and beyond. It should be juniper predominant, but all gin should be juniper predominant. So we are already making extra criteria and adding our own interpretation of what it means from a flavor perspective to say that you're London dry gin. All right. So I get that, yeah, contemporary and classic can be confusing. The way I look at it is really classic gin is juniper predominant, probably has an archetypal flavor journey in the way that you look at often it's citrus, then into the heart of the matter, and then onto spice. Obviously, there's different slight variations on that, but really you do get that 3-parter, predominantly using dried botanicals. Classicism really involves a very squeaky clean base spirit. I don't think you can have these sort of progressive base spirits and say that you have a traditional archetypal gin. I think there's very much, that's very much part of classicism, is a neutral base spirit. I point out that there's a reason why there is gin clear as an English expression. Do you know what I mean? It's gin clear. That's what, I know it's not really that common anymore, but again, historically, traditionally, classic gin probably doesn't lose. Contemporary gin, however, I think that's broadly accepted that that's not a problem whatsoever. And the base spirits, depending on where you are across the world, can be a little bit more open to subjectivity, whether it's 95% ABV as opposed to 96, whether you're using fresh botanicals or abundance of fresh botanicals as opposed to dried, whether you're really playing around with that idea of flavor sequencing and flavor journey and that archetype of, citrus, juniper, and traditional, then spice. Contemporary gin really plays with that. I think contemporary gin also plays a lot with a sense of place, and regional botanicals a lot more playfully. So I think there are ways to do that, and I think to answer one of the questions that came in terms of, is there somewhere where you can actually have a read of where this, what we're defining as classic, what we're defining as contemporary, and what we're defining as flavor? Absolutely, that's provided as guidance to the team. And for anyone who is worried, by the way, about which do I enter still, I'm not sure. It's the same answer as always. Let's have a chat, because the entire team is really trying to get you in the right place to do a fair and honest assessment. I don't think IWSC is trying to define gin globally. We're trying to say, look, we're asking for people to, we're trying to do some form of fair assessment in which we require people to enter in such a way where we can actually go, hey, look, I'm looking at your spirit in the way that you've intended it to be made, from a flavor perspective, against others of a similar ilk. The last thing that you need is to then go actually have, like, you know what, I'm gonna have this really contemporary gin and then right next to a classic, and then it's apples and oranges, and it's really hard to compare, and then you get poor consistency across the board. So I don't think it's about defining anything globally. I think, as you say, London Dry Gin does cover flavor, but all gins cover flavor. But again, this work in the real world, flavor gin exists, contemporary gin exists, London Dry Gin exists, classic gin exists. It's such a broad category. It's such a broad category. What we're trying to do is just get people to enter we're assessing flavor. Let's try and get people to enter from a flavor perspective in the most appropriate possible way. Why not have a London Dry category and a classic gin category? Yeah, I think down the line, there's no reason for that. There's no reason why we can't do that. I just think for now, let's just move the headline things into something that's a little bit more cohesive to the way that it's been for the past 6 years, and brings that into line with the others. There's absolutely no reason why we can't revisit this and go, all right, if we have those, and the bulk of those are anyone who doesn't want to talk about process and just want to talk about flavor, one of those three. If you're very specific about the process that you wanted to be judged under, and not necessarily the flavor profile that you've done, yeah, there's no reason why we can't revisit this idea of having London Dry as another one. Didn't really want to do that this year because we wanted to just be simple about, look, there's 1, 2, or 3, unless you've got a sub-style that's really easily defined, and really not try and reduce it down. I think that feels like it's quite so down the line. Absolutely, that's possible, Charles, from your question there. But I think just this year, let's just try to structure the whole thing so that it's much more cohesive, much more coherent, and everything is flavor based.
I may just add something. I'd like to say that at the IWSC, we have nothing but the utmost respect and admiration for the London Dry as a subcategory of gin. We do know how much effort and soul goes into production of a good London Dry gin. And of course, our purpose, as Olivier already said, our purpose was not to create confusion, was to create a fairer judging process for everyone. But we do have the biggest faith in this subcategory, and we are going to put the biggest effort into promoting it as well and championing our London Dry winners. And actually, starting from this year, which I think is great news, we are going to have a separate dedicated producer trophy, the London Dry Gin Producer Trophy, which is our most prestigious annual trophy that we award for drinks producers across all categories. We are also going to do a lot of publications across our channels, across our consumer magazine, Club Enologique, our trade platform, the IWSC website, championing our London Dry winners. So we do hope that we don't come across as someone who disregards or dismisses this category, but the opposite. We are actually going to put some extra effort into championing it and educating, as Olivier said, educating the public and the consumers about the peculiarities of this category.
Yeah, so Andrew, absolutely. That's we do a lot of that is done in triage ahead of time, right? So Dave and Aditya and the team again from that they from a judging process. Let's just talk about it, and I'll answer it like fully, and you'll really understand sort of why sometimes it happens ahead of time, sometimes it happens in front of the judges. The ideal is for the judge to not have to make that decision ever. And if we've got the flighting sequence right and order right and pre-work done correctly and to the best of our ability, really, it's a rare occurrence if that happens. Look, judging process is very simple. For this year, what we're going to be doing, I think a bit of time trying to prime judges ahead of time as well, in terms of discuss with them, what the expectations are, what the day is going to be like. Most of them are returning judges. We're really fortunate to have a fantastic team of very experienced individuals who are coming back to it. A lot of them, are very familiar with tasting plenty of spirits every day in terms of as making assessments, whether through with their work or through other activities. So, but that said, we're really trying to create this sort of cohesive team unit that we're bringing into it. So the judging day this year is going to start off with a 30-minute conversation brief. It's very open. The reason for that is that we're talking about trends, we're talking about expectations that we have, really going through and providing extra clarity on the days, like, right, are we 100% sure everybody knows the scoring system inside out, the medaling system inside out? Those are the obvious practicalities that, of course, we talk about well ahead of time and we send briefing notes and all that kind of stuff. But just on the day, let's just remind ourselves. The other side of it is to get the different perspectives of the judges, right? They're all from around the world, which is great. And so, and they're all looking for different things, like a distiller might be much, much more acutely aware of base spirit integration with botanicals. No problem. And they'll be talking about that a lot, and that's going to be high up on their agenda. But hearing them talk about it might help someone who comes from a bartending background to go, yeah, you know what, I'm looking at this from a mixability perspective as quite high up on my agenda. Now that you've said that, I'm going to make sure. So you really get this dialogue going. I'm really hoping to get this dialogue going for half an hour. I really use it as a moment, yeah, to talk about those expectations, some of those preconceptions maybe, so that when everyone sits down, we've all had an open discussion about it. The other side of it is, again, this year, what I'm really trying to do is create that first one of the day is, whilst I'm not going to say this is a silver or this is a gold or whatever it is, but really have something that's an undeniable medal winning gin as a way to calibrate everyone. Now, everyone might be on a slightly different spectrum as to where they are, but so obviously I'm going to pick a historic gold probably, or a historic high silver, something that we all feel is undeniably of high quality. And really then that way, as a huge team, we can then talk about that openly together and say, look, this is the reasons historically that has happened. I'm not saying that if you have to do it again, but historically, this is what we've deemed a medal winning gin. And then you might be different kind of gin, but then that means that everybody splits off into panels, right? Those panels are very deliberately set up. We don't just put a random person next to a random person alphabetically. It is very much like we're trying to get panels where there is a commentator, there is a bartender, there is a buyer, there is a distiller. And if you can have those four elements, those four different perspectives at minimum, and maybe more people than that, but if you can get those four different angles going together in the same thing, you have a great conversation. Assessment happens obviously through flights. Those flights are brought out sequentially. So it starts off low ABV. That's a really important thing to know. And then it ramps up during the day. You don't just get this yo-yoing that's going on through the day. There's so much work that goes into it. What the judges see really is a tray, numbers on tasting glasses, and you get to see roughly the ABV and the region. Right? The reason you get roughly the ABV is that there's nerds like me, and if you told me this is made from Scotland and it's 43.2, I'll tell you which gin it is. Do you know what I mean? And it's too obvious when it's so specific, and that's the level of judge that you're dealing with, and the level of nerdery involved in it. I'm super proud that that's the team that we have. So you get rough ABV, like basically a 1% or 2% incremental. You get the region as well. And the region is really important to understand from a judging perspective, because it allows you to frame your expectations about what they're going to be made locally, what they're allowed to do locally, what, you know, and some of the, and maybe understand it, because get, I don't know, some of the more progressive Japanese gins and put it next to even some of the more contemporary European ones. And stylistically, they're quite differently. And so it's easy to, when you group them together and go, right, I know where that's been made, and it allows you to potentially understand some of the botanicals a little bit more, or at least assume that might be part of the consideration of a distiller there versus a distiller here. So it allows you to read a little bit more into it so that you can understand, well, you can actually, should say, articulate better, or better pinpoint the likely botanicals that are creating these amazing flavors that we taste. And then, yeah, over a day, there isn't, people ask all the time, how many gins you taste in a day? And I get it. It's a big part of palate fatigue is a concern, and concentration is a concern. And those two things are really, there's no finite number is the answer to that question. And the reason for that is that sometimes it's about groupings. Like, let's just say you're dealing with flavored gin all day long. You don't want to be dealing with six strawberry gins, and then tomorrow a different group do the other 4 or the other 5. You want to be doing all 10 of them in one go to have a fair assessment, to compare them like by like. So sometimes some groupings are bigger and smaller, and they vary. Equally, ABV is a really big factor. If something's just ramped up real quick, you have to have less than a day. You can't be doing the same amount of samples if they're all at a slightly higher ABV. That's just normal. So a lot's paid into attention. So there's no specific number. Around 50 is a good thing to sort of to understand. There's around that, but it can sway depending on the style or those other metrics. Panel chairs are done ahead of time. I just really want to point this out. So, each panel will have a chair, like as in a little micro chair ahead of time, and they're really the ones responsible for feedback. This is a really big part of the assessment. We'll talk about how we go about doing the assessment and evaluation, but it's really important to understand this. Is like there is, everyone's paying attention to try and do feedback, but there is one person on every single panel who is there going, hey, how do I consolidate this into something that I can actually really provide back? So it's not like incoherent or 4 different voices that contradict each other. It's like, no, what do we collectively say as feedback for this thing? There's one person there, and that's the real value that you can get. And then there's me. I'm the SJC. I kind of try and oversee it. What I'm looking at over the judging day is obviously trying to G up the team, get everyone on the same pattern. The other side of it is to really try and look at data coming in to see if everyone's being as consistent as they can be. It doesn't really matter if someone's a little bit lower in their, judging scores and someone's a bit higher. So long as they're consistent every day, these things balance it out. And that's what I'm looking for. And I'm looking at data from scores and feedback from everyone to try and encourage people's voices to come through, to make sure that everyone's voice is being heard, that everyone's being consistent across the day. I'm also looking at tempo. So like tempo of the day, how long that day takes. It really can't go too fast. Though obviously, if it goes too fast, the nature of the assessment is too quick and it deserves more time. But you can't go too slow either, because otherwise you just can't concentrate for massive amounts of time. If you're doing this over an 8-9 hour time, you just can't do that level of concentration and expect to be consistent. So there is a tempo to it. I try and bring everyone back into, and try and get that. I'm obviously there to help settle any debates if we have, or ask further questions, or see if I can unlock some other things as well. So yeah, that's the judging process. So much is done in terms of that flighting, though, like in terms of going, all right, so we're trying to group people in the right places from the initial entry. And then we're also trying to go, okay, let's try and group you in a similar ABV so that you're comparable and consistent and fair and being assessed with the kind of thing either side of you that is from a, that is a fair representation of where you wanted to be assessed. And therefore, you don't just get, as I say, apples and oranges, because it's just all over the place. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Olivier. If I may just add something, while, as you said, the amount of samples can change tasted throughout the day, we never have more than 65 spirit samples tasted a day. So this way we can really avoid palate fatigue, and this way every single entry is really studied under the microscope, and the judges have the time to discuss every single entry, and it's a really kind of rigorous and fair judging process.
Commercial success is dependent on so many different things and regionality. So it's really hard to answer that question in a really direct way. There's no reason why it couldn't be. You know, like if you just look at flavor trends from a perspective, you know, what's going on and what we're seeing right now. Again, IWSR data would suggest that flavored gin is tailing off globally. It's stabilized at 7 to 10% of the category. It's in decline here in the UK. And it really depends on the regions. I think you've got to look at it going like, I don't think there's one size fits all from a global perspective. I think gin is now this is just absolute colossal beast of a category, and it's amazing. It's never been a better time to be a gin drinker. Just on the basis that there's so much out there, and actually that each region really has its own specifics, you know, like that what works here in the UK is so completely wildly different than what will work elsewhere, and there are specifics to each market that dictate certain flavor trends. So there's no reason why not. It just depends where and when, and you know, again, commercial factors such as price point, and so I don't think you can say on flavor and flavor alone, yeah, that's a smash hit, because you can sometimes get the best gins in the world, and actually the other parts of the puzzle aren't necessarily answered. So it really depends. I don't see many people who are apologetic. Look, I think neo-hedonism as a movement is obviously gathering pace, you know, and we are in a, you know, as we found out, you know, Gen Z is a sober, curious generation. I get that, but I don't think that necessarily means that there's a negativity or a stigma attached to alcohol. I think that, you know, realistically, people always buy into the same things, and they always have. They buy into fantastic flavor profiles, fantastic ideas and brands that are authentic, that speak and resonates to them, and that are presented in ways that are not just from an availability perspective, but an affordability perspective. So I think there are so many other factors. I think if you're really talking about alcohol, you've missed the potential of gin. Really, a gin maker isn't an anaesthetist; they're a storyteller, and we have these amazing stories that are encapsulated in liquid form. And so, and those, it's not just in liquid form either. It's through the brand, through the messaging, through everything in the world that they create. And that's what's amazing about judging them, is that you can suspend disbelief for a second and then just immerse yourself in a completely different journey. And then you can take yourself back out. And all of a sudden you've just had so many different stories over a day. So I think if you're talking about alcohol, perhaps I would suggest that actually the move from that perspective is to go, look, let's talk about flavor. Like flavor is what sells. People really are flavor led, and that's what they gravitate to. And when they're looking for more and are looking for other reasons to buy something, they're looking for other reasons to buy into something. So I would ask, what's your why? Why are you doing this as a profession? Why are you a gin maker? We all have the reasons. What's our why? Our why is all different, but they're all there. And how are you communicating that? I think people buy into that passion. They buy into people. They buy into, like, you know, they buy into place. They buy into all of the things that you stand for. And I think that's how you can connect with a new audience. So it's less about alcohol and all about these amazing things that are already a part of the category. And that's why gin actually stands really nicely as a way to just fit in with this new generation, because we're talking the same stuff. We're talking about sustainability. We're dealing with all of that stuff. We're talking about stories. We're talking about reasons. There's so many authentic brands out there. So I'm not too worried about that. I would just say lean against all the other things that makes it special. From my as a journalist, and as someone who's just spent 3 years in wholesale, I would point out that things that are, I mean, towards the future of zero ABV gins, not great, because it's by default not a gin. What you're trying to say is a zero ABV spirit that is mimicking gin. I'll have that. I'll entertain that conversation. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. But like, so of no alcs, they're fantastic. But what we're really seeing, and again, if you look at all of the trending reports coming out of Dry January and all of that kind of stuff, really, it is the brands that are talking about themselves as like, we're not the zero version of that. We're not that. And, you know, and even Ben Branson, founder of Seedlip, was talking about this the other day, like a couple of weeks ago, to go like, oh, you know, what to drink when you're not drinking. In retrospect, that might have been a great tagline back then, but it's probably not appropriate now. It's not about brands that are doing well aren't presenting themselves as, oh, we're not that. They're saying we're this. And when you're saying I'm not a full alcohol gin, you're saying what you're not, great, but you're not saying what you are. And all of the brands that are doing really well are actually quite confident about what they are and what they're doing, and they don't necessarily position as an alternative to, as in a more, I'm talking a more mature, low and no market. They're not those who are really getting traction right now, just saying this is what we're about, and this is what we do, and this is who we're for. And those who are saying actually we're not this. If you don't want that, we're here. We're actually so. There's a natural separation of the pack that's happening as the category matures. That's what I've seen anyway. That's my opinion. But you know, like there's definitely alternatives, botanical alternatives, zero ABV alternatives are incredibly popular, resonate with the consumer, are fantastic for conscious consumption, and for those who are moderating. So I think that they have an enormous future. I just think that more and more you'll find them not really talking about what they're not and talking about the idea that they're not a gin, but they are botanical. They're just saying, hey, I'm Everleaf, I'm Pentire, I'm so-and-so, I'm so-and-so. And as opposed to, this is what I'm not. So as someone who does tastings, I would really say that no. Unfortunately, they do not, which is kind of to your point that you were saying earlier on. There's an enormous education job that we as IWSC are committed to champion, to educate, to further explain, etc. Is it made in London? Honestly, you'd have thought that we'd be over this by now. We're 20, 30 years into the gin boom. Does London Dry Gin have to be made in London? No, it doesn't. We all know this, we're trade, but a lot of consumers just haven't really paid that much attention to it. So again, it's going back to the basics. So do they really understand what it is? I'm not sure they do. I'm not sure that they do understand the technical processes. It has to have this or that. You know, a lot of people struggle getting past, okay, what is distillation? They can't even envisage it and picture it, let alone, oh, your heart's cut's over 70 ABV. You haven't added your methanol contents. That I don't think they think about it that far, and so I don't think they've fully understood it in that way. If you want me to do a speed round of the questions that have come in as a Q&A, do you want me to try and answer a few as we go along?
If you can do it within like 3 to 5 minutes. Yes,
okay. So where does gin liqueur stand as a lower ABV 32? I would say unless it's slow gin, enter it into the liqueurs. What we're going to try and do is, you know, slow gin, very specific. You know, like again, there's going to be a lot of gin liqueurs in the liqueur category. I think you'll be this far better assessment there, unless it's slow gin, which has a very it has a very specific place to it. So I would point out that the liqueur category within IWSC is probably more appropriate. You know, in terms of other questions that had come in terms of, you know, gin trends around the world. I saw that in terms of, I'll ask beforehand, is gin growing globally or in decline globally from Australia? That question came in. The answer is no, it is going up globally. Just regions have different trends going up. Currently, if you look at the data since 2012, again, IWSR data, plus 5% per annum by volume, plus 10 is the average by value since 2012. But if you look at it from 2019, actually plus 18 by volume, 27 by value. So it is growing. It just depends on the different regions. Some are not, such as the UK. You know, duty free, for example, is back to pre-pandemic levels. So, you know, or just there or thereabouts. So there's a lot of gin isn't in decline globally. It's actually, in a sense, globally, it's just very much now region specific, and there are now hotspots that are driving volume, and obviously big markets that are in decline. So it depends on where you're at and what you're doing. But the question about luxury gin that came in as well ahead of time, you know, what's the future for luxury gin? I'm not talking super premium. I think it was very much like the €60 and above type, you know, super luxury gin. I think actually the US is probably somewhere that might be of interest there. You know, I think there, if you look at the Discus numbers that have come out over the past year and a bit from a trend perspective, super premium is almost double in terms of what it was since 2020. So it's a lot of interest in super premium in the US, probably driven by the acceptance that tequila can be super premium, and actually comparative, even though it's expensive for gin, it's not expensive comparative to that. So there may be something there. In terms of people asking about sort of, where the growth is and all that kind of stuff, I'm only seeing a slight acceleration in the US in terms of growth over there. European drivers very much Italy and France right now. UK and Netherlands, we're in the minus, whereas Spain is stable currently. So I think that answers a lot of the pre-registered questions in a speed round there.